Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'nasan Lanu Es Toraso Baruch Ata Adonai Nosein HaTorah Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Okay, so tonight is the 24th of the Jewish month of Teves, of Tevet. And it happens to be the yartzeit, the anniversary of the passing of who we refer to as the Alter Rebbe, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya that we studied many years ago, because of course we've been doing this class for a long time. I think we dated by Musya, who's 11 and a half. So I think that means we've been doing it for 10 years or something like that. So more towards the beginning, maybe about 9 years ago or so, we did study the Tanya, but it's been a long time. And then of course, recently we studied Igeres HaTshuva, not the entire Igeres HaTshuva. That's a portion of Tanya, which the Alter Rebbe wrote explaining the concept of repentance. So we did that in the summer for a while. We did a number of chapters in that. And I thought tonight, in honor of his passing, especially as we have studied his work and now we're not, so maybe tonight we should do something from Tanya, because let's just explain a little bit about the significance of a yartzeit in general, and the yartzeit of a tzaddik, of a very, very godly person specific. Then we'll explain a little about Tanya, and then we'll learn a little bit inside. So a yartzeit. Yartzeit is a very Jewish word, meaning I have a pretty decent English, and I don't know such a word in English. Did they have such a word in Russian?
No.
No. It's a Jewish concept to celebrate and mark the anniversary of the passing. There are certain things that are Jewish concepts. Like, for example, another word that I don't know in English, but that might exist in Russian is mechutin. Hi, Bella. A mechutin means you're the parents of your daughter-in-law or son-in-law. They become related to you because you share children. Yeah, you're mechutanim, exactly. Mechutanim. Now, there is no such word in English. There might be a word in Russian. My Russian is about nil. Is there such a word in Russian?
Mechatunim.
That's not Russian.
Yeah,
that I know. You see, my Russian's better than you think. You can't fool me.
Well, we didn't know it was. I mean, it was just I remember saying even back home many years ago.
Yeah.
Swati. I think it's called swati in Russian, right? Go.
Da.
So there is such a word in Russian?
Yes.
But somehow Miriam didn't use it, even though she wasn't a Yiddish speaker, but she said mechutanim.
I remember that word. Maybe my grandmother was speaking Yiddish.
You remember that word?
Yeah, I did.
It doesn't exist in English because, to be honest, in America, and for that matter in England, it's not a concept that you would feel a familial connection to your daughter-in-law or son-in-law's parents. Like, it's enough you feel a familial connection to your daughter-in-law or son-in-law. That's like a pretty good stretch. I mean, they are going to be perhaps the parents of your grandchildren, but like, that's it, you know. But Judaism is a very warm, embracive, family-oriented culture. We celebrate family, we celebrate community. Community becomes an extension of family. This class is a community, and there's a certain bond because that's how Jews do things. So similarly or not is the concept of a yartzeit. A yartzeit is something that exists in the Jewish terminology, and maybe in Russia you knew the word yartzeit? Did you know that word when you were in Russia?
Yes, годовщина смерти.
So you knew the concept in Russia.
Yeah, but
Again, in English there is no such term.
But
for
we
yartzeit.
never say yartzeit.
You never said
Not one word.
yartzeit, but you said the
It's
Russian
best-
equivalent. You said the Russian equivalent.
Yes.
Yes. But in America,
That's-
there is no equivalent because again, in our culture, the date someone passed away, like, it's just not something that's culturally thought of. Someone passes away and whatever. A year later, you're going to commemorate that anniversary. It's like, just doesn't work like that in America. It doesn't work like that in England, our mother country. Just doesn't, it's not part of the culture to like remember and celebrate and note these things. So it's literally the word doesn't exist in our vocabulary. But in the Jewish culture, yartzeit is a word and it is a concept. So what's the concept of a yartzeit? So the concept of a yartzeit is that when a person passes away, the soul first is busy detaching from this world. And that's a job. And that's a bit of a difficult job, a bit of a painful job. Not painful because they don't want to leave as much as they're sort of like anchored in by various things they've done wrong over the course of a lifetime. And they have to disengage and get cleansed from that. And there are certain cleansing processes they go through. Kabbalistically, they're called chibut hakever and kaf hakela, which are cleansing processes to cleanse the body and to cleanse the soul. And then ultimately the person probably goes through a period of what we call Gehenna, a spiritual purging of the soul of anything they did wrong in this world that they didn't repent for. And we believe that it would not take more than a year for an average person, unfortunately most people in essence are good, so an average person should be finish the job by a year, which is why we say the Kaddish prayer for 11 months. We don't say it for an entire year because we don't want to imply that this person needed 12 months till they got to the good place. Because that Kaddish prayer, which is said 3 times a day, and if someone passes away, it's very important to make sure you hire someone to say the Kaddish prayer for them if they don't have a child or a husband or someone that would say it for them. And in that Kaddish prayer, which is said 3 times a day, it's the strongest way to help the soul be elevated as it undergoes all the cleansing it needs to. And of course, whatever other good things people are doing to elevate the soul, charity or prayers or extra Torah study, extra good deeds, whatever people do, lighting Shabbos candles and having them in mind, whatever good things people do to help the progression of the soul. And the soul ascends and ascends and ascends and gets cleansed and gets cleansed until it's finished the Gehenna process and can enter into what's called Gan Eden, which, means this godly place and a godly abode of pleasure, a godly abode where the soul benefits and enjoys all the good it did in this world, most primarily whatever Torah it studied. The Torah study of this world is really the food, the pleasure of Gan Eden. For a certain degree, the commandments, but much, much, much more strongly, the Torah study. And the soul in Gan Eden is growing. There's natural growth. There's growth 3 times a day. Just as we pray 3 times a day, there's a 3-time daily small movements of the soul, incremental movements. And then there's a very big day on the calendar, the birthday, because birthdays continue above. And on the birthday, the person makes a big party, has a big gathering, and has a big jump forward. But the biggest day on the calendar for each soul is their yartzeit. Because the yartzeit is that day when there's that big forward jump. And that's why the yartzeit's a very, very significant day to honor, to make sure the Kaddish prayer is said, to make sure to give extra charity, to have Mishnayos study, a part of Torah that we study specifically to aid the soul. and many other different things we do, all on or in connection to the yartzeit, because the yartzeit is the day that's most significant for the soul of the entire year. So for every Jew that ever lived, their yartzeit is their most special day. But when we talk about the yartzeit of a tzaddik, of a godly person, a pure godly person, the yartzeit has a very different additional layer of meaning. Meaning for any person you were close to when they passed away, you mark the yartzeit, you can light a candle on the yartzeit, you say extra prayers on the yartzeit, you want to help them. You want to help them because this is their best day to ascend, and that's what they want to do. So you want to help them ascend because that's what they want to do, and you can help. So that's how we generally think of a yartzeit. It's a day people that it's possible, they go to a cemetery to connect to the person that passed away. That's very traditionally done on a yartzeit. But when it's tzaddik, when a very saintly, godly person has passed away, the day of the yartzeit has another implication for the Jewish people. And that we actually learn from the Alter Rebbe, whose yartzeit is tonight. So of all people, he is the one that taught us what is the yartzeit of a godly, perfectly godly person at tzaddik. And he explained that on the passing, by the original passing, however many years ago that was, all of the godliness that this tzaddik, that this pure godly person created his entire lifetime, crescendos in that moment of passing, it's all shining. And then every year after, on the day of the yartzeit, all of the godliness he accrued, he created his entire lifetime, is shining in this world on a higher level, because everything constantly is ascending in godliness, and brings salvation to this world, creates salvation for this world. So create salvation for this world means the energy's out there, but who can tap into that energy and draw down on the energy? Specifically those that are connecting to this person. And we connect to the person, to this godly person, this godly individual, by studying their Torah, studying what they taught. Some people connect by singing the songs they've composed, by sharing stories of the godly person who departed. On all different levels, you share a story to connect to the actions of the person. You share the Torah to connect to their thoughts. Maybe you sing a wordless melody to connect to something deeper than thoughts. But you're trying to create this connection so this energy that's right now shining in this world can come in your direction. You can absorb it, and it should truly bring salvation to the world. So that is the yartzeit in general. And that is specifically the yartzeit of a tzaddik, of a pure godly person. And for the godly person we're talking about tonight, whose yartzeit is tonight and tomorrow, is the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was a founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. So just very, very briefly about him, very briefly. He was raised in a home where his parents were very, very, very special people. And they themselves were adherents of the Hasidic movement, which was a relatively new movement at that time, but they didn't tell him. Because their leader, as we say, their Rebbe, who was Rabbi Yisrael the Baal Shem Tov, told them he should come to it on his own, not just because his parents are, so he's going in their road. On his own, he should come to this. So therefore, he only once met the Baal Shem Tov in his lifetime. It says when he was 3, the Baal Shem Tov said to bring him to him. And his mother and him traveled in a wagon. He didn't know where he was going. He was a 3-year-old child, but a very precocious 3-year-old child. And he came, and the Baal Shem Tov cut his hair. And afterwards, he would always ask his mother, who was that person that cut my hair? I remember, who was he? And she said, grandfather. And only many, many years later, he knew that was the Baal Shem Tov. The truth is, it says about the Baal Shem Tov that before the Alter Rebbe was born, the Baal Shem Tov was very excited we refer to Rabbi Shneur Zalman as the Alter Rebbe, which means the old Rebbe, implying the first of this dynasty. So it says the Baal Shem Tov was very excited before the Alter Rebbe was born, and he told his students, his disciples, why was he so excited and happy? Because a new soul is entering this world. Meaning already at that time, when the Alter Rebbe was born, which was several hundred years ago, there weren't really new souls. Everyone had already been around probably quite a few times. And the Alter Rebbe was a new soul. His soul had never before come into this world, came into this world for this very specific purpose. What was the purpose of his soul's journey? To take the movement of Hasidus that had already been around 3 generations very surreptitiously, with Rabbi Eliyahu and then Rabbi Yoel and then Rabbi Adam Baal Shem, and now 2 generations publicly with Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem and then his follower, the Maggid of Mezrich, to take it and to translate it in a way that the intellect could comprehend. Meaning the Hasidic movement that was made popular, made public by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem, who was the 4th Baal Shem. Baal Shem means master of God's name, because he was able to work miracles through God's name. Even though he taught very deep things to the private circle of his most intimate followers, but to the general public, his message was very foundational, emphasizing the specialness of every Jew, joy in Judaism, prayer, belief in God, very basic tenets. And the really deep concepts of Hasidic philosophy weren't really publicly disseminated. And also in the next generation, by the Maggid of Mezrich, where he had a whole circle of very great, in their own right, giants of Torah, giants of spirituality, and they absorbed his teachings, but it wasn't something that could be translated to the common people. It wasn't digestible. And that was the job of the Alter Rebbe, to take the deep, deep, deep ideas of Hasidus, and they shouldn't just be privy to the greatest minds, both learned in Torah and very brilliant and very spiritual and very holy, and only they could really understand it. His job was to make it fit every man's brain, us. And that's what he did. And his seminal work that we have studied was called the Tanya. And in that seminal work, he made God understandable. That's a pretty big accomplishment, because God, by definition, shouldn't be understandable. He's too big to be understood. So we're not making him small. He's still too big. But despite being so big, as one studies and thinks about the Tanya and applies it and studies it some more and thinks about it some more, God becomes more and more something your mind comprehends. Doesn't take away your faith. There's still plenty of room for faith. But we have an injunction, it says in Torah, know the God of your fathers, that you should serve him with a complete heart. So we start off believing, and then we use our minds to understand. And then when each one of us very personally reaches that place where our mind no longer understands, we ascend to a higher belief. And Chabad Hasidus, what the Alter Rebbe founded, is to give us that ladder of understanding God, each one of us as much as we can. And that's what we do primarily through the Tanya. The Tanya is the most seminal work of Chabad Hasidus. It's like the written Torah of Chabad Hasidus, and there's myriads and myriads and myriads of many, many other deep expositions on Hasidic thought, both from the Alter Rebbe and from all of his successors. The current Rebbe is the 7th generation from the Alter Rebbe, and in a direct line. It's a lineage, 7th generation from the Alter Rebbe. So I thought tonight we could study a little bit of Tanya. So we all should have the privilege of connecting to the Alter Rebbe and being able to channel this tremendous promise, this tremendous guarantee. He told us that by the passing and yartzeit of a very great holy person, all of the godliness they've created their entire lifetime is shining and brings salvation in this world. And when we study his work, we're connecting on a soul level to him. So through that connection, we can absorb this energy And each one of us, we should merit that it should bring salvation in our world. A tzaddik, godlike, puts himself in his writings. We learn this about God. When God gave us the Torah, the first of the 10 commandments is, I am God, your God. And in Hebrew, the normal word for I is ani. But the first word of the 10 commandments is not ani. It's a different word. It's a very fancy word for ani that we don't usually use. It's anoichi, which translates as I, but just, I don't know, a different word for I. And our sages say anoichi is an acrostic. I will say it in Aramaic. I don't expect anyone to follow. Don't worry. Anoichi, Aleph, Nun, Chaf, Yud, stands for Ananafshi Kesavas Yahavis. It's okay if that didn't make any sense. It's Aramaic. What it means is I put myself in the writings. So when God gave us the Torah, in the very first word of the 10 commandments, Anoichi, I am God, your God, God said, Anoichi, I put myself in the writings, which means when I give you the Torah, I give you myself. You want God? Study his Torah, because he's in his Torah. So as you study his Torah, you get him. God's limitless. We are finite. But when our finite minds grasp whatever level we can grasp of the infinity of Torah, we are containing God in our minds, because God put himself in the writings. And similarly, every tzaddik, every pure godly individual puts himself in his Torah. So when we study the Torah of any tzaddik that has passed away, of any godly person on that caliber, we not only learn and intellectually absorb their teachings, on a spiritual plane, we connect to them through studying their works, because they also wrote themselves into their writings. As there's the expression of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Reb Shalom Dov Ber, that before he passed away at a very hard time in Russia. It was like, just when the communists were taking over and the Bolsheviks, it was a very chaotic, hard, difficult time. And anyway, a hard time for a Rebbe to ever pass away, but especially then it was, so his only son was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was like, what are we going to do? Like, you can't leave us. Don't leave us. We can't handle this. He actually said he was passing away because he couldn't be in the same world as the communists, as the godless communists. He was leaving. And he said, Ich gehe zu Himmel, I go to heaven, aber die Ksavim lasse ich für euch. But the writings, my writings, I'm leaving for you. I'm going to heaven. I'm checking out of here. But my writings I leave for you. The question is, so what? That's not what we want. But what he meant was, through my writings, you can get me as well. So as we study the writings of the tzaddik, we can connect to him. And especially, again, on a yartzeit, it's a very good idea. So any questions or any thoughts on any of this before I start teaching something? Okay, so I thought we would learn just straight from the introduction to the Tanya, which like maybe we did 10 years ago. It was a long time ago when we studied the Tanya. So I'll give a little background to this introduction. So the Alter Rebbe spent about 20 years writing the Tanya. And when it was done and he was about to publish it, which was quite difficult in those days in Russia to publish a religious work, it was the Tsarist regime didn't make it too easy, but he went through the process and he had people very involved doing whatever they could politically to get permission to publish this work. And the Hasidim, the followers of the Alter Rebbe, heard about this, of course, and they were quite concerned. They weren't too happy. They weren't too excited about a Tanya. Why weren't they excited? Because they were thinking, we don't want a book. We want a Rebbe. We don't want to be told, oh, here's a book to know how to connect to God. We want to talk to our Rebbe and connect to God through him. So there was a lot of hesitation. There was a lot of discomfort among some of the Hasidim knowing that the Alter Rebbe had put 20 years into this work and knowing that now this was going to be the go-to, they weren't so happy. So as the work was being published, which again was not simple, so it took a while, the Alter Rebbe wrote this letter that he sent to his followers, which is printed as part of the work. He doesn't call himself the author. Out of his tremendous humility, this work that took him 20 years to write, he calls himself the melakhet, the compiler, implying, I just compiled a few ideas, in my spare time over 20 years. And he's sending it to his followers. So the letter has this first paragraph sort of introducing it with greetings and blessings. And then it has 3 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, the Alter Rebbe basically says, it seems really impossible for a book to make it. Why does it seem like a book's a really bad idea? And he spends an entire long paragraph, the longest section of this letter, explaining the difficulty in writing a book to reach people spiritually. Meaning, if you want to write a book about Jewish law, okay, like here's the law and you write it down. That's not so difficult. But that's not the function of the Tanya. The function of the Tanya is to connect us to God. We learn the Tanya to connect to God. I believe it was Rabbi Berditchev, who's a famous, great person of that era. And he was very close to the Alter Rebbe. And when he read the Tanya, he said, wow, the Litvak, they would call the Alter Rebbe the Litvak among his close friends. The Litvak, he put such a big God in such a small book. So the Alter Rebbe took a very big God and he put him in this very small book that when we learn this very small book, we connect to him. And the Alter Rebbe has this huge challenge because he's got a lot of followers. And he has to make that very big God fit in this very small book so all of his followers understand it and get it and connect. But how do you do that when people are so different? So the Alter Rebbe spends the entire paragraph of this letter affirming that that's like an impossible task. Affirming we are really all so different. And he brings, like being the Alter Rebbe, who's very analytical mind, very, very, very brilliant mind. And there's many stories of the Alter Rebbe from when he was a child, the brilliance of his mind, the unbelievable head, unbelievable brilliance, and unbelievable ability to convey this in writing. Unfortunately, at the time of the Alter Rebbe, that was when the enlightenment movement was beginning and gaining prominence. It was beginning then. And they sent spies. The enlightenment movement were trying to take Jews and pull them away from God. And they were able to infiltrate the camps of those religious Jews that were not Hasidim, but they weren't able to infiltrate the Hasidic camps because the Hasidic camps were too emotionally connected to their leaders and too entrenched in their relationship with God, too pious, and they couldn't find foothold. So they sent literally spies, incognito, people pretending to be Hasidim into the spiritual camps to try to figure out how they could gain a foothold, which they thank God never were able to do. And we have the writings of one such very famous spy from Berlin who had infiltrated the camps of the other religious Jews, the non-Hasidic camps, and he was very successfully infiltrating them. And now he was trying to infiltrate the Hasidic camps. And he writes back, basically writes back it's impossible because these people are just too crazy about God and their Rebbe and all that. So they're just like, but he writes about the Tanya because they were very excited about the Tanya and he saw it and he read it and he couldn't believe the genius. He said, of course, the topic is ridiculous because the topic's all about God and that's ridiculous. But the writing, the brilliance, and that it follows every rule of Hebrew grammar. These people are very into Hebrew grammar. They made that a sort of religion. He couldn't get over that. I mean, what he was talking about was crazy. But still, even though he disagreed with everything it said, he still was awed by the brilliance of the writing of the Tanya. So the Rebbe, in his very brilliant fashion, is analyzing why a book shouldn't work. And he says, just bottom line, it doesn't make any sense that a book could work to reach people. He's first reassuring them that they're right. It doesn't make sense. This is a bad idea. Because people are different. Every single person is different. And that's actually something very special that God did, that he made every single one of us unique. None of us is like the other person. There's actually a blessing we would say if you were ever in a gathering of 600,000 Jews, God willing, when we have the complete revelation of Mashiach, we will be there with millions of Jews. There's a blessing to say. There's like, I think 6 or 7 blessings we're supposed to say that. And one of the blessings is, but it's not a messianic blessing per se. It's a blessing if you're ever in a gathering of 600,000 Jews. And the blessing is Chacham Harazim. Please remember. Chacham Harazim. What does that blessing mean? You'll all remember. Chacham means the wise one. Razim, a raz, is a secret. The wise one of the secrets. What blessing are we saying to God? When you are among 600,000 Jews and you look around and you say, oh my, every single person here is unique. Every single person here is different. No cookie cutters, no mold. Everyone is a secret. And you're blessing God, the wise one of the secrets, that he could do this, that he can make 600,000 people, and every single one is an individual. So that blessing, the Rebbe says, proves that truly we're all different. And then he brings a proof from Joshua, that when Joshua was being praised as a leader of the people, what was his great praise? That he could relate to every person. And I says, why was that such a praise? Because every person is completely different. So to be a person that could relate, in Joshua's times, there were about 3 million Jews. To relate to 3 million people, each one absolutely different, that's a leader. And then the Rebbe goes on and speaks about how books are so hard to understand. And even if something is good is in the book, it's hard to digest it. It's hard to relate to it. It's hard to translate it. And the only thing that really contains all of us is Torah. Because every single Jew has a place in Torah. Every single one of us. Every single one of us, we have a specific address, personal to us in Torah. A specific word, a specific letter, something in Torah is mine. And there's a place in Torah that's yours. Each one of us is found, uniquely written into the Torah. Not that we necessarily know our place in Torah, but we're all in Torah. But only in Torah, the Rebbe says, seemingly, can we all be contained in one book. And the Rebbe says this really goes back to the source of souls, because souls come from different energies. God, as all of our souls traveled from the repository of all souls down to this world, every soul has a different personality. And the personality of the soul really impacts our own human personality, meaning your personality is really coming from the energy of your soul's personality. And your soul's personality, I'm using the word personality because it's a word we can relate to, your soul's personality has to do with what was the soul's address in its descent into this world. And every soul has its own individual address. And some souls address their location before they enter this world is a very emotional one, and a very giving one, and a very kind one. And that's the energy of the soul, and that's the energy of the person. They're just loving and giving and kind, and it's not because they worked on themselves. That is their energy, because that's their soul's energy. And some people, conversely, are very withholding and very discriminatory and judgmental. And that's their energy, because that's their soul's energy. And some people are very intellectual and they're not emotional at all. And that's their energy, because that's their soul's energy. So every single one of us has a very unique personal energy, because of a very unique energy of our soul. So how can one book work for us? So that is, and I only gave a little bit because I couldn't give all the details because we don't have that much time, but those are some of the ideas the Rebbe shares, and he shares many more to basically prove that a book shouldn't work. But he's sending them a book. So the next paragraph the Rebbe says, but I know you very well. Even though I'm saying a book can't work, and I'm saying it's impossible for a book to work, and I'm saying the only book that actually holds us all is the Torah, we don't even know our place in Torah, and we all are so different on intellectual levels and emotional levels and spiritual levels. But I know you very well, the Rebbe says. I know you well. Meaning it can't work. And I think in my personal opinion, which of course I could be wrong, as I'm probably wrong in many things, but maybe the Rebbe emphasized so much how, I mean, you could say it was just psychological to first agree with them and then tell them, but we're doing it anyway. But I look at it like the Rebbe wants us to appreciate how great the Tanya is, because it shouldn't work, but it does. And the Rebbe says, why does it work? Because I know you very well. I know you so well that I wrote the Tanya for you. Who is the for you that the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya for? Every single Jew that would be from the times of the Rebbe through the complete revelation of Mashiach. For each individual Jew, the Alter Rebbe writes, he wrote the Tanya. And the Rebbe writes here very strongly that originally, like, I understand you don't want this book because we would talk. And when we spoke, the Alter Rebbe writes very beautifully, and it's very beautiful how he writes this, there was a lot of words of love between us. You would come to me and it was a very loving conversation and you felt very heard and very loved. And you revealed to me all of the secrets of your heart and of your mind. Everything that was going on in your life, everything that was going on in your service of God. So when you would come to me, it was a very good experience. You felt very good. You felt very heard. You felt very cleansed. You felt very nurtured. You felt very guided and personally directed. So it was a great system. But I'm talking to you, and the Rebbe says, I'm writing to you. I'm pouring my words to you. And my tongue should be like the pen of the scribe, meaning all of those loving words should now flow from my pen and be in the paper of this work. And why is this? There says, first of all, I want you to know what I wrote. I'm skipping, obviously, because we wouldn't have time to do this whole thing. So I'm just pulling out a few of the lines here. I wrote all of the answers of all of the questions that constantly people are asking me. I know your questions, and I'm giving you the answers. And every answer I'm giving you, I'm writing in this work. So whatever your question is, for any Jew, from now until Mashiach, and it's not such a big book, the Tanya, I wrote it all in this book. And why do I have to do this? The Rebbe says very simply for two reasons. One, there's no time. There's so many Hasidim. At this time, first of all, the Alter Rebbe was very popular. It was an amazing thing he was doing because he was very unique, meaning among all the Hasidic dynasties that were just beginning then, everything else besides the Alter Rebbe's Hasidus that became called Hasidus Chabad, they were all emotionally based Hasidic groups, meaning they were all based on a personal relationship to the leader, we call the Rebbe, on spirituality, on prayer, on song, on connecting to the tzaddik. But the Alter Rebbe's had another very significant component. The Alter Rebbe's was based on intellect. It was based on your mind digesting these concepts and through your own personal work, becoming closer and closer to God. And that was unique. He was the only one that ever did it. That's what his movement was, unique to all other Hasidic movements and different. And that's why Hasidus Chabad, Lubavitch today is different than any other Hasidic group. The only group like this that there is, what he started. So there were many, many, many people that were joining. And also for various reasons, other Rebbes in his area had to leave. Some were chased out by the Misnagdim, some different things were going on at that time in his area where he lived in Russia. And therefore, there were fewer and fewer spiritual leaders like him around. So therefore, more and more and more people joined him. So he's saying, oh, we don't have time anymore for this. And he said, people forget. I can tell you, you can forget. Here, you'll never have the problem forgetting. You'll just relearn it. And therefore, then listen to what he writes. Now, I exaggerate, but he doesn't. This is what he wrote. I'm going to translate it word for word. Therefore, I wrote down all the answers to all the questions to be guarded, to be assigned for each person as a memory in front of their eyes, not to push to come anymore to speak to me personally, though of course people didn't. Of course, he accepted people for private audiences throughout his entire life, that in them he will find the comfort for his soul and the correct advice for everything that's difficult to him in serving God, and his heart will be steadfast and trusting in God who completes everything for us. So the Alter Rebbe is making an incredible promise here, because the Alter Rebbe is telling the Jewish people, he's not saying, I wrote this book for the 10,000 or 20,000, I have no clue, followers that I currently have. And because I know you all very well, all 20,000 of you, I managed in this one small book to write down all of your problems and to give you the advice to deal with all your problems, all 20,000 of you, which would be unbelievable. The Alter Rebbe says, I am writing all the answers to all the questions anybody's going to have from now until Mashiach. And it's a pretty small book. I mean, his original book that he's talking about was 53 chapters. So the question is, I mean, it's amazing. And obviously it's true, because he's not going to say something that's not true. But how did he do that? How is that in the Tanya? So how I understand it, this is my understanding, so this might not be the answer. But in my understanding, how I think all of the answers to all of our questions are in the Tanya is because I think what the Alter Rebbe did in the Tanya was find the spiritual path for each soul that its voice should be heard by the person. The spiritual road that each Jew could walk to uncover his soul, to uncover his natural love and fear of God, which is what Tanya is all about. That each and every Jew that learns the Tanya hears his soul's voice. And I think, sure, just let me finish this from a hold your thought, don't forget it, write it down, because I'm going to give a little bit of a long answer and then I'm going to take your question. I just don't want to lose my train of thought. So here's the Alter Rebbe writing a road, writing a guide, a map for the soul of every Jew, that as we follow his map, our soul's voice gets stronger and stronger and stronger inside of us. And I believe, and this, again, this is just, I understand it, that as we more and more hear our soul's voice, we know all the answers to our questions. Because all of the answers to our questions are really inside of us. I'm basing my assumption, my thoughts, on a famous incident that happened with the Alter Rebbe. So that's why I think perhaps this is correct, but I could be wrong, and maybe there's a very different answer. That the Alter Rebbe once he sent a message to a certain community in this area of Russia. This community was called Shklov. And he sent a message to the community of Shklov that he was going to come for a visit. Now, this little innocuous message threw the whole town in a turmoil. Why? Because the community of Shklov was full of people that were very opposed to the Hasidic movement. At that time, there were a lot of Jews that were very opposed. There were a lot of Jews that were adherents. They're basically all religious Jews. As I said, the enlightenment movement was just starting, and it was like in Berlin. So everybody here was religious. All these Jews in Russia were religious at this time. If they weren't religious, they probably weren't in Russia, they were somewhere else. So all these Jews were very religious, and there were very religious people that were very opposed to the Hasidic movement, and there were very religious people that were part of the Hasidic movement. And Shlov was a town basically of people that were very opposed. Also, Shlov was a town don't forget your questions, wait a while. Shlov was a town of great Torah scholars. Now, the Alter Rebbe, who of course we're not referred to as the Alter Rebbe in those days, he sends a message, I'm coming to visit. And they were like a little confused because he's one of those people we don't like. We don't like those people. They really not only philosophically oppose a movement, they really didn't like the people. But we know that this specific one is considered a brilliant Talmudic scholar. So it would be nice if he came because we could ask him all our questions. But we really don't want him to come because we don't like those type of people. So what should we do? Like they were like a little confused. And finally, they decided that what we're going to do is each one of us is going to present to him our most difficult Talmudic problem. What's been driving us crazy for the past weeks and months, and all the great scholars can't help and nobody can answer this question. And if he can answer all of our questions, we'll listen to him. And if not, we'll chase him out of town. Fine. So they don't tell the Alter Rebbe their plan, but they figure it's a great plan because if he can truly answer all their questions, we do want to hear him. And if they can't, so we're not going to give him any honor. We're not going to listen to him. So he comes in this huge study hall in Shlov, and it's full with all these great scholars in order of their greatness and age. They were very official. They were all sitting there, rows and rows and rows. And the Alter Rebbe comes to the front and they tell him, well, we first want you to answer all of our questions. And he said, no problem. That sounds like a good idea. So the oldest says this very long, complicated question. And the Alter Rebbe says, okay, next. I'm like, you're not going to answer me? Next. All right. Well, the next one starts saying his very long, complicated question. The Alter Rebbe says, okay, next. And everyone's getting like really nervous, really tense, really anxious because he's not giving us any answers. He's just hearing our questions. Like he can't hold them possibly in his head. I mean, by the 17th question, for sure, he forgot like the first 5. Like, what is he doing? They're getting really upset at him. But this was the rules. They didn't say he had to answer them one at a time. So they had to still wait there. Huge room full of scholars, and every single person said their question. And the Alter Rebbe didn't say, we're just next. And when the Alter Rebbe was finished listening to everyone's question, the Alter Rebbe started to sing. The Alter Rebbe was very musical. He composed 10 very spiritual melodies. And he sang, I don't know which one he sang. And as he sang, each person there felt his soul energy beginning to shine, like become unencumbered from all of the junk around it. And each person started hearing more and more the voice of their soul inside of them. And each person felt a greater and greater clarity coming into his own mind. And by the time the Alter Rebbe finished singing this Hasidic melody, every single person there knew the answer to his question. And that was how the Alter Rebbe answered the questions of each and every person there. And then he spoke, and they understood that he had answered all of their questions. So they did listen to everything he said. And after he left, a number of the younger scholars became followers of the Alter Rebbe because of this encounter. And that's how we know it, because they wrote up what happened. So perhaps that's what the Alter Rebbe is doing in Tanya as well, that he's really giving us a journey for our own soul. And as our soul goes on this journey, we hear more and more clearly the voice of the soul inside of us, and we get the answers to our questions. Frima, what were you going to say?
Okay, so my thing is, there are plenty of people that have learned Tanya, the full Tanya, that are not religious, completely not even interested in Judaism. So how can you say that if learning it, this is what's going to bring them closer and they're going to know all their questions, and by just learning it, because there's so much garbage around every person, in the world that we live in nowadays, everywhere you go, there's garbage surrounding us. So how can you say that this is the answers for our soul if we're learning it?
Alter Rebbe
How can the Alter
take
Rebbe
away your free choice? He gave you the road. He gave you the answers.
But I'm saying
It doesn't remove your free choice. In other words, we sometimes I could throw this question out to everyone. You can answer with your virtual hand. Has anyone ever been in a situation that they knew exactly what the right thing was to do, but they didn't do it? See, the only person here that's honest enough to say, of course. Me and Chava and Froma. Okay, I believe more people. Maybe you're forgetting. And Rivka and Orly. We've all been in those situations. We've all been in situations that we know what's right and we don't do it.
And we still didn't do it.
And we've, of course, sometimes been in situations that we know it was right and it was hard and we did it. We've been in both. As a person is studying something like the Tanya, they hear more and more clearly the voice of their soul. It doesn't take away a person's free choice to ignore the voice of their soul. We can always ignore the voice of our soul, but now we have the opportunity to hear it. And that's the gift the Alter Rebbe is giving us. But you're right, you said actually something very smart, that it's not just me with my own inner junk. There's a whole world around me that's trying or anyway confusing me, making it harder and harder to hear voices of truth and voices of purity, harder and harder sometimes to do what's right, when it's so much easier to do what's wrong, when it's so much more convenient, when so much in the world. But you know what? I think now, because we are so close to Mashiach, I think there's also a lot that it does. I think like on a certain level, I sort of see both in the world. I sort of feel like on one hand, there's a lot of confusion and fear and garbage. But I also feel there are a lot of people that are sincerely searching and finding truth in God, maybe in a way that didn't happen before. Does anyone else experience? I mean, I don't know. This is what I'm thinking. Anyone else has that like sense one way or another, what they see in the world around them?
I see that, but I also see the opposite. Like I know somebody.
I just said I see both. I see both.
Like, but I see someone like in front of me today told me they were engaged to somebody who's not Jewish, and she was raised going, learning Chassidus, and she believes in Hashem and she believes in everything, but she just, I don't know, she just doesn't care.
And you're saying you see both. Anyone else?
Very strongly.
What do people see in this world around us nowadays? Anyone has any thoughts on what they see? Does it seem to them a world where there's more voices or energy that's blocking God, or is there God also, or and any thoughts?
This is Chava.
Hi, Chava. So nice you joined us on your not Chicago in vacation with your grandchild who's probably sleeping. We're very impressed you made it.
Yes. So that's why I decided I will say a couple words. So what I see, I agree. I see all the spectrum, but for us, people who came from Soviet Union, completely knowing nothing about God, or almost nothing about, knowing like very little, close to nothing about God, right? And we came here, and some of us started looking America, right? America, you have everything. Nobody pushing you to be a religious Jew. There's plenty of secular Jew who live a very nice, comfortable life. And we having this comfortable life here, much more comfortable than when we were in the Soviet Union. We started looking how to get closer to Hashem. And I see even second generation, like if like, let's say my generation didn't get chance to get closer to Hashem, I see a lot of young people, third generation, from being away from God completely, looking for it and coming back. And that's, to me, this is the most amazing thing. When people grow up in secular family, their parents are secular, their grandparents are secular, secular, everything around them, and they have this internal strength to find God and be with God and go and learn. And like this, I think this is absolutely totally amazing. That's what I see in this word. Yeah, that's a balance.
I think you're right. I think that is such a beautiful testimony to the unbelievable spirit of the Jew. Because it's a harsh world, and yet there's God in it. And somehow there are those sparks we find and we connect and we get ignited by, and it's easy not. There's plenty else in the world that's doing everything else. Just like every Jew maybe is a little bit like our forefather Avraham. Says Avraham was called the evree. Have you ever heard the term evree, which people translate as the Hebrew? Because Avraham was called the evree, and it says, why was he called the evree? What does that mean? And it means aver, which means a side. Evree, if you ever heard the word evree, which again gets translated as the Hebrew, means a side.
In Russian, evree, it's a Jew.
Jew, right.
But
That's actually a Hebrew biblical word, evree.
We're called evree.
Right. And evree is a Hebrew word. That Russian word is actually a straight Hebrew word, evree. And that's how it's translated. People translate it as Jew, Hebrew, Jew. But why was he called the evree? He was called Avraham the evree, the evree, the Jew. Why? Because it's from the word side, aver, a side. And we're told, our sages say he was called the evree. If now you want to know why that Russian, which was probably a non-compliment, the slur, evree, why, what were they saying? What were they saying about you? Evree means the whole world was on one side and Avraham was on the other side. He was the evree. He was on one side and the whole world was on the other side. He was the only one in his world at a certain time that believed in what we call today monotheism, that believed in God. It was a world where every other human was an idolater besides him. And from being this evree, from being on one side and being the only one, person by person, he spread this belief in one God to the world. And every one of us is an evree, which means every one of us has that stamina, that's inner strength, that the whole world could be giving us other messages, and we're an evree. We can be on the other side. We have the strength. We know it's true, and we believe it, and we search for it, and we find it, and we can be on the other side. We're okay, because we're an evree. That's what it means. So when those Russians were calling you that in a derogatory way, this is what they were telling you about yourself. You are an evree. You have the strength to be on a different side than the whole rest of the world. Anyone else has thoughts on this besides Chava?
May I? We see both sides, that's for sure. And I picked to see only positive moments of our life and search only positive attitude in the books and highlight all positive measures, all positive moments which are helping us to survive. It's very important nowadays. I don't know if it's like my personal choice or my professional choice, but it's helping. It helps me, it helps my family, and I think that this is our choice. What are we trying to do? Whatever we want to see. We know that both sides are existing, but each of us is making that choice. And Judaism and reading books is helping and making our life, wouldn't say easier, but the more we learn Judaism, the more we understand that we are not alone, that we have help.
Exactly. Maybe not easier, but it's clearer and you're a little bit stronger because you said you're not alone.
Hmm?
Yes. I agree with you. And I agree with everything Orly's saying. I 100%, just like Chava, 100%. There is both in the world. And Orly's right. We have a choice. We have a choice what we're going to absorb, what we're going to embrace, what we're going to identify with. But I believe, and maybe both are stronger than ever before. The negative voice sounds very compelling and strong, but I believe that the voice of godliness is also very strong now. I believe it's a very strong voice. And maybe because we're very, very close to Mashiach, and that's why both are very strong. You know, it says that it says in the Torah about Moshe, about Moses, that he was the most humble man that ever existed. That's what it says. Again, Torah is Torah of truth. So truly, the most humble man that ever existed was Moses. The question was why? And there's various answers given. It says that God showed Moses all the generations that would ever be until the advent of Mashiach. He saw it all. It must have been, he saw a lot of hard stuff. Jewish history has a lot of hard stuff in it, but he saw everything. And it says that when he saw the final generation before the coming of Mashiach, when he saw our generation, it says when he saw how dark the world was then, and yet how Jewish people were still hanging on, still believing in God, still serving God, we humbled Moses. And that's what made him the most humble man that ever lived. Because he was so humbled, he was so in awe that people could be with so much darkness and yet still have so much light and still be so connected to God despite everything and just be so firm in their relationship. And that's a very unique quality of our generation, that our sages call us the heels of Mashiach's coming. Ikvisa de Mashiach, the heels. And the heel is not such a positive complimentary term. The heel implies we're the bottom of the whole structure of the body of the Jewish people, which is true. And the generations before us were holier, correct. We're wiser, correct. More knowledgeable, absolutely. More refined, more godly, all of the above. And yet we're the heels that are supporting the entire structure of the body. It says, what's the advantage of a heel? I mean, it's not its sensitivity. It's not its intellect. It's not its great personality or sense of humor. What's the advantage of a heel? The advantage of a heel is the nullification, that it will be stepped on. It will support the entire body, which in a human being translates to acceptance of the yoke of heaven, a nullification to God, an acceptance of his authority. We don't understand so much. That's true. We might not feel so much. We might not understand so much. We might not be too knowledgeable. But despite all of those facts, we still serve God. We serve God even though we don't understand everything, even though we don't feel everything, even though a lot of it's way over our heads, we still serve God. And that's the advantage of our generation. That's what makes our generation so special. And that's why our generation, we're told, is a generation that will bring Mashiach, precisely because of this heel-like ability, which is something that creates more redemption than all of the brilliance and refinement and spirituality and emotions of previous generations. Our acceptance, the yoke of heavens, even though it doesn't make sense to us, even though we don't understand it, that's specifically the quality that brings redemption. And that's our generation. So this is considered a very unique generation, a very special generation. I think what Chava said also really highlights the specialness of this generation in this idea of people that were raised, as she's saying, several generations secular and are returning to God. And that's a very unique phenomenon because historically it was never like this. In Jewish history, you were Jewish, which meant you were religious, which meant you were committed to Judaism. And if you somehow decided you couldn't handle it anymore, you just pretended you were a non-Jew. There was no concept historically of a non-religious Jew. You were a Jew, which meant obviously religious, or you were already not a Jew. And then with the enlightenment, that gained more ground, then began this concept that people could be Jewish, but not serve God as Jews. So it's, relatively speaking, a very recent phenomenon. And then as that gained more and more ground, it seemed like, well, how would Judaism hold up when all these people are just saying, oh, this is so cool. We could dress like the non-Jews. We can talk like the non-Jews. We can eat like the non-Jews. We can intermarry among the non-Jews. And like, what do we want? All that stuff that just gave us a lot of pain and stress and made us so stigmatized, and we suffered so much for it. Like, what do we want that for? So it seemed, if a person was looking, that like Judaism would die out. What would make people stay Jewish when they could just be like everyone else and be accepted? And yet, despite all that, as Chava said, people with no knowledge of Judaism at all, not from themselves, not from their lives, not from their parents' lives, not from their grandparents' lives. Maybe for some of them, not from their great-grandparents' lives. They're making tremendous choices with a lot of sacrifice to live Jewish lives, to live authentic Jewish lives. And that's a tremendous testimony to how much Jews really love God. It's really, really an expression of how much Jews love God, that even when they've been generationally so far from him, there's something in that spirit that just flickers up and ignites and compels them to live for God, even though they don't even know really what that means. Anyone else? Anyone else have any thoughts on this? Well, it is a bit late. I just want to remind everyone as we started that tonight's a very special night. It's the night when we have the energy of the Alter Rebbe, of everything he accomplished, all of his Torah study, all of his good deeds, all of his influence on the Jewish people. It's all shining, and we all just spent the time connecting to him. As we studied his writings, we were connecting to him in his writings. So we all have a direct line, and use it well. Try to think how you want to channel that energy and how you can turn to God with that energy to create salvation very personally in your life. If you have any miracles to share next week, I'd be very excited to hear. And we should all share and see and rejoice in God's goodness. He wants our good, and it's so beautiful when we just see it so revealed. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. It was a wonderful class to be with everyone, this family of the class.
Thank you.
Thank you.